Hey everybody, welcome back to the River Youth. Whether you're watching this on our YouTube channel or one of our social media pages, we hope that you've liked and subscribed as we continue to put out content each and every week for you to just devour and just enjoy. Tonight, we are going to be concluding our series on the stories of faith with a really exciting one that really has a lot to say about us, but really even more to say about God. And so we hope that you will enjoy it. Here we go. Who doesn't love a good story? They make us laugh, they make us cry, they challenge us to be better people. So what if we told you that God gave us stories? Stories of people who are just like us, and stories of people who knew and trusted that God could do anything. Over the next couple of weeks, we invite you to join us as we explore great stories of faith, stories of a powerful God with powerful people doing powerful things to change the world. Tonight, I want to kick off with a device that's used in literature called Deus Ex Machina. Now, if you've been in English class, you might have learned this expression already, but Deus Ex Machina literally means a God from the machine. And it gets its roots from Greek and Roman history, where they would be doing plays and the hero would be in this impossible situation, and then all of a sudden a god would be lowered in on a rope and would fix the entire situation. And so Deus Ex Machina is a device, it's a figure of speech for when your hero or your protagonist in the story that you're reading or the movie that you're watching is in an impossible situation, and all of a sudden they find a way out. Here are some ways recently that you've seen this played out. In Toy Story 3, they're in an incinerator. They're heading to the fire. They know that they're about to perish. And so they look at each other and they hold hands and they're getting closer and closer, and they close their eyes. And all of a sudden, boom, a claw comes in and plucks them up out of nowhere. And it's the little green men, and they go, the claw, and we laugh and we enjoy all of that. Then this one might step on a couple of people from this youth group's toes, is Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. In Harry Potter, the Chamber of Secrets, he's in the Chamber of Secrets. There's the bad guy, Tom Riddle, who reveals himself to be Lord Voldemort. Spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read Harry Potter. And Harry has to fight off against a basilisk, a gigantic snake. How in the world is Harry, this 12-year-old boy, going to defeat a gigantic snake? Well, a phoenix named Fox comes out of nowhere and blinds the snake, which helps Harry be able to defeat it, but not after being poisoned by the snake. So Harry's getting ready to die. What happens? The phoenix shows back up and cries tears into his cut and heals Harry, and Harry walks away completely unscathed. Or here's a really recent one. Captain America is standing down Thanos. He tightens up his shield. He's ready to go. But he knows that Thanos is going to win. He knows that Thanos is inevitable. And there's no way that there's like all hope is lost. And then you hear the words, on your left. And all of a sudden, all these portals begin to open and all these heroes begin to rush through. And what commences next is one of the best battles in history. You see, Deus Ex Machina is often considered to be a lazy form of writing, because what it does is it pins our hero in an impossible situation, and rather than come to a logical conclusion of how they could escape it, something comes in at the exact right moment, at the exact right time, to sweep away the bad guy, to take care of the problem, and it's just an easy, quick fix. And a lot of people who tend to think critically about stories and storytelling don't like Deus Ex Machina because of how illogical it is. And I guarantee you, one of the biggest problems with Deus Ex Machina is because we don't get that in our everyday life. When life gets hard, when life gets tough, when we feel like we're just getting pummeled into the ground, all we want in that moment is someone to say, on your left. or for the phoenix to show up, or maybe the claw to come down and pluck us out of that situation. But oftentimes, they don't come. And as much as we plead, and as much as we beg, and as much as we want them to come, they don't. And for a lot of us, that's when questions begin to arise. We begin to ask questions like, where's God? Or, what is he up to? What is God doing? Or even, some of you guys might even ask this question, is God even there? Well, tonight, we're going to look at a story that really shows us what God is up to and how God can be in and amongst our midst, because tonight we're looking at the story of Esther. Now, the story of Esther is a lot more complex than ones that we've had in the past. In fact, our first story in this series was the story of Ruth, which was 4 chapters long. Rahab was next week. It was even shorter. Esther, it's not like this huge story, but it's a 10-chapter book, and there's a lot of moving pieces. And so tonight, we're not going to go into every single detail. We're not going to go into a huge amount of backstory. We're going to give you the essentials of what you need so you can know the story of Esther. And really what happens is in the story of Esther is you have to understand a little bit of historical background as to what's going on. You see, at this point in time, the nation of Israel is no longer a nation. In fact, they're in captivity. They've been taken captive, and currently the people who have control of them is the Persian Empire. So our story begins with the king of Persia throwing these huge festivals and elaborate banquets and these elaborate parties. For 187 days, the king of Persia is throwing these parties. And he is having himself a drunken debacle, if there ever was one, right? He's having the time of his life. And he says in one of these drunken states, hey, I want to get my queen out. I want her to come, and I want her to show her beauty off to all of my guests. But the queen says no. The king is furious about this. How could his queen say no to him? Who does she think she is? So he not only he does 2 things. One, the first thing is he issues a royal decree that women have to be subservient to their husbands. And 2, he immediately begins the process of finding a new queen. So let's say you're king. Let's say you're a very powerful king. You want a new queen. What do? Well, you host a beauty pageant. And you bring in all the beautiful single women of the kingdom. And so he brings in all of these women. And who wins? Who is decreed the most beautiful of them all? Queen Esther. And of course, Esther, she rises up ranks. She's shown favor. But what you don't know about Esther is she is actually a Jew. In fact, she was an orphaned Jewish woman who was raised by her uncle Mordecai. And you're going to see that Esther and Mordecai are our 2 heroes in this story. As Esther is rising up ranks, as she's showing more and more favor, Mordecai stumbles upon a plot to kill the king of Persia. And so he lets the people know, and he tells the officials, and they're able to stop, and he is able to save the king's life. Meanwhile, the villain of our story, a man named Haman, is also rising into power. And he gets to such a point of power, he says, I want everyone in the kingdom to bow down to me. Well, this doesn't sit well with one specific person, Mordecai. And Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman. Haman is furious. And he goes to the king of Persia and he says, hey, because of what Mordecai did, I want to eradicate and kill off all of the Jews. Now, king's drunk, of course, because he is during a lot of this story. And they roll dice and they say, this is the day in the future where we're going to exterminate and we're going to get rid of all of the Jews. Mordecai hears this and is in anguish. He tears his clothes, covers himself with ashes. And he contacts Esther and he begs her and he pleads with her. Is there any way that we can save our people? Esther knows that if she asks for the king to go against his decree, she could be killed. But look at what Mordecai tells Esther. It says, Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. Mordecai takes a look at this situation and he knows that things are bad. He knows that things don't look good. Not only are his people in exile, not are they slaves to this pagan culture and to these outsiders, but now the date of their genocide has been planned. But he knows that God is up to something. And so he contacts Esther and he says, hey, maybe you were made queen. Maybe you were set in your position of power because this was going to happen. Esther's response is incredible here. This is what she says. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go see the king. If I must die, I must die. I love Esther's response here. She says, maybe this is the time. In fact, I want you to fast, and I want you to help me with this, because if I have to die, I have to die. Why else would a Jewish woman not only be favored, not only become queen, if God wasn't doing something here? So she puts together a plan, and she plans a banquet, and she invites the king and Haman, and she gets them incredibly drunk. Okay, I mean, we're talking hammered. Haman gets up and leaves. And he's going out, and who does he stumble upon? Well, Mordecai. And ultimately, he becomes infuriated with Mordecai. He becomes so incredibly angry that he begins to plan Mordecai's death, and he erects a spike for Mordecai to be placed on the very next day. So, her plan completely backfires. Let's throw this party. Maybe I can get them drunk. Maybe I can convince them to do something else, because drunkenness leads to really bad decision making, right? And ultimately what happens? Well, now Mordecai is set up to be executed. But something really neat happens next. Mordecai, the king of Persia, can't sleep that night. In fact, he's having such a hard time sleeping that he ends up asking people to come in and to begin to read the history of like his people and like what's going on. And they read about how Mordecai had saved his life. Remember? How Mordecai had found out about the plot to kill the king? So when Haman shows up the next day and he says, hey, I want to kill Mordecai, the situation is flipped, and the king says, no, in fact, you're going to celebrate Mordecai, and we're going to have a parade in his honor, and you're going to lead it. And so Haman actually has to celebrate Mordecai, and Mordecai is saved. Now, because Haman tried to kill Mordecai, in fact, Haman ends up in a bit of tragic irony, being killed on the own spike that he erected in order to kill Mordecai. So not only is Haman celebrating, but also has to pay the punishment that Mordecai was meant to receive. However, the decree still stands for the Jews to be killed. And the king, by law, is not allowed to reverse a decree he's already made. So Esther just asks a simple question. What if the Jews were given the opportunity to defend themselves? So the king decrees that the execution day is still going to stand, but the Jews are going to have a chance to defend themselves. And how do you think it ends? Well, of course, the Jews are not only not eradicated, but ultimately they end up wiping out their enemies. So because of the faith of Esther, because of her being able to take that step and say, you know what, I'm going to trust God in this, because maybe this was the time. Maybe there was something going on that was bigger than myself. Here's what happens. The Jews are saved, their enemies are destroyed, and they begin to receive favor in the land. Interestingly enough, in the story of Esther, in the book of Esther, God is never mentioned. We just see this as we read through the story and we see all of the cogs and all of the pieces, that God was up to something the entire time. And because of that, it leads to our main point for the lesson tonight, which is this. We can trust God's plans even when we don't see them working. We can trust God's plans even when we don't see them working. I oftentimes think that when we're stuck in the muck of life, when we're stuck in the swamp and we're just churning through and it just never seems like it's going to end, and it just seems like it's day after day after day of fighting, those days where it just seems like nothing's ever going to get better, that oftentimes we lose sight of who God is. In fact, I was reminded in a sermon that I was listening to earlier this week that somebody pointed this fact out, that after the pandemic of the Spanish flu, we entered into World War I, the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and then after all of that was over, we entered into World War II. So I don't know what's next on the horizon. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know what's going to happen the next day. I don't know what's going to happen in this next month. But I do know this. We can trust God and we can trust His plans even when we don't see them working. So that means if you're having what I call an Alexander, horrible, terrible, no good, very bad day, because of what we know about God, we can hope that the next one is going to be better. If you have a Alexander, horrible, terrible, no good, very bad week, well, maybe the next week will be better. Or Alexander, horrible, terrible, no good, very bad month, maybe next month will be better. We can hold the truth that God is going to be up to something, that God is going to be working, and that things are going to get better. I brought up Captain America earlier because he's one of my favorite heroes, and one of my favorite scenes with Captain America that you see over and over and over again is he might get hit and he might get beaten down. And he's like thrown in some trash cans in the first movie. And he stands up, and what does he do? He wipes it off and he holds up his fist and he says, I can do this all day. Let me ask you a question. Do you have a faith that can say, I can do this all day? Do you have a faith that's not going to be destroyed by a pandemic or to be destroyed by a horrible, terrible, no good, very bad season? Or do you have a faith that looks and knows that God is up to something even when we don't see it? Because you know what? That's the kind of faith that Mordecai and Esther had. That's the faith that Rahab had. That's the faith that Ruth had. That God was going to take care of His beloved, and God was going to take care of His people. And so, I want that faith for you. You know, when my hardest and toughest times happen, when I have a really hard time seeing God in and amongst all my troubles, it's not until often that I'm in the future and I've passed all those times that I look back and I see that He was working through that entire situation the entire time. And the same can be said of your life too. You might not see what God's doing, but maybe this was a time, and God was waiting for such a time as this to do something incredible in your life, just like He was working in Esther and Mordecai's. I hope no matter what life throws your way, you can trust God and you can trust His plans, even if you don't see them working.